was some command of God. And so what we find here again is that Saul is confusing what he has desired with what God desires. And the people, though, knowing that Jonathan has by helping to launch this surprise attack, Jonathan has enabled the Israelites to achieve a tremendous victory over the Philistines, routing them from the field, although unfortunately not smashing them ultimately. That would have been what they wanted to do, to drive them completely out of the land. But he has helped them with a tremendous victory. And in helping them with that tremendous victory, now here's his father proposing to put him to death. The people won't have it. They rescue him, it says. And as we saw there, Saul then breaks off his pursuit of the Philistines. Some of the commentators suggest, again, that this was due to him realizing that, oh, I've done something foolish. I've done something regretful. I've done something sinful in not allowing the people to, or not strengthening the people to pursue against the Philistines. But others have thought perhaps this was more petulance, that here the people have rescued Jonathan, and it's the idea of, well, if you're not going to follow my rules, I'm not going to lead you, or I'm not going to, I'll take my ball and go home, kind of an attitude. And that he really doesn't have that sorrow for sin. He really doesn't have that repentance, that contriteness that he ought to have, given that he is in this leadership role. He ought to have some degree of contriteness over this foolish order he's given, and does not. We talked a little bit then after that about Saul's wars in his family. We see that he is he's in constant warfare. His entire kingdom, his entire reign as king is one of war. He's fighting the Philistines. He's fighting the Moabites. He's fighting the Ammonites. He's fighting the Edomites. He's constantly in battle with one group or another, virtually for the duration of his kingdom. He maintains, therefore, a standing army. He recruits men that he sees as being valiant men, worthy men, and recruits them into a standing army so that he can be able to go against the enemies of Israel whenever he needs to. So we come into the 15th chapter. Now this is perhaps, again, an event of Saul's greatest failure. We read here in chapter 15 this clear command. It says, Then Samuel said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of the hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself up against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We see here in this opening paragraph, then, kind of this opening statement, here is God's command. We notice here that Samuel repeats this, that this is from the Lord. He repeats that twice. He first of all leads off, though, by pointing out God put you in charge of the army. Basically, God put you in charge of all of Israel, for a purpose. And now here's the word of the Lord, and there's what God is telling you to do. He kind of emphasizes this isn't Samuel's idea. This isn't Samuel's doing. This is coming from God. What we see here, of course, is that Saul takes it upon himself to change things. We go on then in verse 4. Then Saul summoned the people and numbered them at Telem, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek, and set an ambush in the valley. And Saul said, the Kenites go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to all the sons of Israel when they came up from Egypt. So the Canaanites departed from among the Amalekites. So Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. Saul takes it upon himself to modify this command. He gets this command from Saul, or from Samuel, rather, there in the first part of this chapter. He's to utterly destroy. This is the idea. You will utterly destroy everything. That was the command. But Saul takes it upon himself to modify that. We see that, we find in this account on 3 separate occasions. At Gilgal, we found that against the Philistines at Michmash, and now against the Amalekites. Saul takes matters into his own hands. He decides, well, I know what God means, but here's what I think he means, or here's what I think I'm going to do instead. He's rather than obey the instructions he's given by God, he's determined to kind of modify things to suit himself. And what we find here is then that God then will ultimately reject Saul. And as we see here, some of the Bible's critics, especially, they look over in chapter 13 and verse 8, and it says, now, in the start of that section, verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed to him as a ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. They think, well, wait a minute, is this a conflicting account here that we have here in chapter 13 versus what we have in chapter 15? And well, the answer is no. In chapter 13, it was told that your kingdom's not going, your lineage isn't going to endure. You're going to be king, but your lineage, your successors will not be from your house. He's told that. Now here in chapter 15, he's going to be told, not only are you not going to have your lineage be a king, we're going to take the kingdom away from you. So it is an escalation, if you will, of the punishment that God brings upon Saul for Saul's disobedience. As we got here in this note, one commentator has the opinion God never finally rejects a man until, after repeated opportunities for repentance, he finally proves himself to be obdurate. And that means, basically stubborn. And that was Saul's problem here. He was determined to be stubborn. He wanted things his way. He didn't care what God wanted. He didn't care. He cared what God wanted only so long as what God wanted was the same thing as what Saul wanted. And the minute that Saul's goals deviated from God's goals, Saul was going to go off on his own path. Again, we see here 3 times he emphasizes the instructions he's giving as from the Lord. The Hebrew word for utterly destroy occurs 7 times in this account. He knows over and over again he was commanded to utterly destroy. And that was repeated to him, as this account gives, 7 times this phrase is used. The Amalekites, of course, were that first pagan nation to fight against Israel as they escaped out of Egypt. We read about them over in Exodus chapter 17 and verse 8. It says, then Amalek, this is as the Israelites are have left out of Egypt, then Amalek came and fought against Israel and Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us and go out, fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that the Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. Then they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And so this was, though, the first nation to oppose Israel as they came up out of Egypt, as they were preparing to come into the promised land. And here's Amalek standing opposed to them and fighting against them. It is because of this that God ultimately curses them. They are to be destroyed for opposing Israel. The phrasing here in this passage talks about verse 15 talks about he defeated the Amalekites. He defeated the Amalekites and he utterly destroyed all the people. Verse 8, he utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Well, we should understand when he talks about he utterly destroyed all the people, that's clearly he didn't destroy all the Amalekites. Some of them got away. Some of them, for whatever reason, weren't in the vicinity of the battle and they got away. We know that because we can read about over in First Chronicles, the 4th chapter. And verse 43, this is in the days of, I think, Hezekiah, if I recall right. And it says, and they utterly destroyed the remnant of the Amalekites who escaped and had lived there and have lived there to this day. This was in, First Chronicles, verse 43. We still find some remnant of the Amalekites still in that area. We also have the account of Esther, if you recall, where Haman the Agagite, suggesting that he is a descendant of Agag, although some Bible scholars want to argue that that's not what the Agagite means. They think it is reference to a place and not a person. But other scholars say no, that he is likely a descendant of Agag, that somehow escaped from this destruction brought on by Saul, and continued then in his lineage, in his descendants, to be a problem, to be an issue for the Israelites. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, God brings his judgment on them. Yeah, I think it is the army, maybe there in Exodus, that is destroyed. And but the people continue, and the Amalekites continue to be a thorn in the side of the Israelites for quite some time. Again, the scholars looking at this, they think that this battle occurs some roughly 25 years after the events of Gilgal. And so Saul has had that time to rule. He's given that command to destroy the Amalekites and now fails to do so. Here in verse 10 then, Samuel learns of this and comes out to confront Saul. It says, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he has set up a monument for himself, then turned and proceeded on down to Gilgal. So Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have carried out the command of the Lord. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people have spared the best of the sheep and oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said to Saul, wait, let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And he said to him, speak. Then Samuel said, is it not true, though you were little in your own eyes, that you were made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed you king over Israel? And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are exterminated. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord? We see here a number of things. We see that, first of all, when God contacts Samuel, we see what God says. He says, I regret that I've made Saul king. And that regret is caused not by some change of God's condition, not some change from God's mind, but rather because of man's unfaithfulness. Man's failure to obey is the cause for God's regret. Then Samuel goes out. He finds, we notice the wording here. He is distressed, and he cried out to the Lord all night. Why is he distressed? Well, Samuel knows, he's the one that put Saul in charge. He was one of the, if you will, one of the instigators of putting Saul in charge. Whether, it was, of course, the will of the people that they wanted a king. We know that, we read that. And yet in that event, it was Samuel, though, was the one who ultimately helped to bring this forward. He was sort of the midwife of all this process, all of this kingship, if you will. And so he feels responsible to some degree. Obviously, he feels responsible for bringing Saul out as king. And now he's crying to the Lord. He's naturally feeling disheartened by it, because they were expecting Saul rather, to be this king that was going to lead them, this king that was going to be doing the right thing. And instead they've got a man who's going off and doing his own thing and disregarding what God has commanded. And so we understand something of Saul's distress in this. We notice then that he gets up early in the morning. This is something that has to be taken care of right away. And Samuel's not going to let it wait. And so he gets on it right away, heads out, and he goes to find Saul. He kind of tracks him down and finds out that he's on his way to Gilgal. So he goes to meet him there at Gilgal. And we notice then Saul's greeting. Saul gives him this nice, flowery greeting that's both flattery to Samuel and a lie, because he says, I have carried out the command of the Lord. Notice that brazenness. Notice the brazenness of this man who believes that he can sort of modify things and still be obeying the command of the Lord. He's been told to utterly destroy the Amalekites. That was the command, but he's modified that command, and it's still good. I still mostly obeyed the command of the Lord. He doesn't even say that. In his mind, though, in his mind, it's an interesting thing. In his mind, he's still done what God wanted. In his view, he's still done exactly what God wanted. And even though here is the evidence in front of him, that as Samuel is going to confront him with the evidence, you see what Samuel says. What is the meaningness of the bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen? You've done the command of the Lord. You can understand Samuel. I can imagine some high degree of incredulity on Samuel's part. What do you mean you've done the command of the Lord? How is it that you think you've done the command of the Lord, and yet I'm hearing all these barnyard noises? What do you think? What do you think that command meant? And we can understand Samuel's absolute astonishment at Saul's fairly obvious failure to comply, and yet there's Saul who's thinking, well, I haven't done anything wrong. And we know people like that, don't we? We know people who kind of flagrantly violate command of God, and yet somehow they're able in their own minds to justify what they've done and say, well, I didn't, everything's okay. I'm still good with God. And you're kind of shaking your head going, what, do you really think you're going to violate the command of God? And it's not going to make any difference? Or do you really think that you're going to do this, have this kind of behavior and not be found guilty? It's an incredible arrogance. It's an incredible arrogance on the part of Saul. Yes. Yeah. Well, that's true. It was what they always do. Other than they had some historic examples where that didn't work out so well. As we go back, of course, to the book of Joshua, where the city of Jericho had been under a ban. They were utterly destroyed Jericho. And we remember what happened with Achan, who decided he would take something, and we saw what happened there. So they had the historic record to know that, wait a minute, if God says utterly destroy, he means utterly destroy. He doesn't mean, well, destroy everything except the good stuff, and you can keep the good stuff. Somebody else had a comment. Yeah, and that is a funny part too. Is that now suddenly it's not? Well, I didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't me who did that. Why, it was these people. Uh, he begins to make excuse here in verse 20. Well, he starts out in verse 15, as Ruth points out there in verse 15. He starts out with the excuses. He says, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep. Well, see, the people want to offer a sacrifice. So he begins with right away, he begins to lay down the groundwork for excuses about why it is that all these animals are still alive. Well, yeah, we're going to put them to, yes, I know God said early destroy, and we will ultimately destroy them, but, we're going to first have a sacrifice. Why put them why kill them right there in the city when we can have a big sacrifice? And of course, when they had a sacrifice, why they would certain parts of the animal, of course, would be burned as an offering to God, but quite a bit of the rest of the animal would be kept aside as a meal. They would they were going to have a big festival over this, and so in his mind, Saul doesn't see that that's wrong. He doesn't, for whatever reason, he decides, well, yeah, that's still, isn't that ultimately destroying the animals if we take them and offer them as a sacrifice? That's not what God said. Yeah, Rick, go ahead. Yes. Yes. Uh huh. Yeah. You're starting to act like what you want is 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 uh, is you're going to bend the will of God to what you want, is what it sounds like. And no, you once, as Rick points out, you once were small in your own sight, and and suddenly you've become very impressed with yourself. Yeah, Rita. Yes. Uh-huh. Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to point out it's not the Lord our God, as if he would include himself in that. It's the Lord your God. That's an interesting point. Yeah, that uh, it's now for you. In a way, this is for you, Samuel. I'm getting nothing out of this. Is almost Saul's viewpoint of it, and there is. Yeah, you're right. There's no sense of that I need to be obeying the Lord my God or sacrificing to the Lord our God, but it's all you and yours, and God isn't really a part of me or involved with me. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes. He had the leadership responsibility. He had the leadership position, and he had the leadership responsibility that comes with it. Yes. That's why you're in charge, not them. Yeah. And that's a good example. Yes. Yeah, that Saul was supposed to be in charge. Saul is supposed to be leading, and instead he's taking this position as if, well, I was just going along with the people. No, you're not just going along with the people, Saul. You're supposed to be leading them. You're supposed to be running this show, and instead you're letting you're letting the people tell you what to do. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I heard that. Suddenly he became a Democrat. Says, yeah. But you see something of the reasoning of Saul. Well, I did obey, he says in verse 20. Then Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord and went on the mission in which the Lord sent me, and I have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And Samuel said, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination as the sin of iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. And, again, here we see Saul's reasoning. Well, I did obey. And you can be, even though it's an outright lie, you begin to see how he's trying to, it's called spin in our culture. It's called spin. Well, I'm going to spin this. Well, we were going to ultimately destroy, because we're going to sacrifice these animals. These animals will be killed. God, it's almost as if he said, well, God didn't say when to kill them. God didn't say how to kill them. So aren't we, sort of at liberty to kill them however we want to? And Amalek, well, Agag, yeah, he's still around, but I have no idea what excuse is in his mind for Agag still being around, other than maybe he's intending to put on a big show of Agag's execution at some point. I don't know. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So the very act of his keeping some of these for essentially a celebration
As trophies, yeah.
It was contrary to the Lord's intention. He didn't want to spoil. You know, it was like Jericho. He didn't want them to spoil Jericho. He wanted them to realize he had brought that victory in Jericho. The same thing here. That wasn't always the case, but it was the case this time.
And they knew that in their history. They knew that. They knew that when God had called on them to utterly destroy Jericho, they were supposed to utterly destroy it. They knew that Achan had not obeyed the command. Achan had decided, well, I'm going to keep something. Here's some valuable stuff that I'd like to keep. And so he kept it and hid it. And of course, we saw what the result was on the nation of Israel. What had happened to those people then? They were then defeated in battle against a force that should not have been able to defeat them. And they knew this. They knew their history. They knew what was going on. And yet here is Saul trying to, as I said, trying to spin this to make it sound like, well, I did obey. And I'm sure that in his mind, why, yes, these animals they're all going to get killed. Give me time. I'll get them all killed. Don't worry about it. And probably the same thing with Agag. Or I'm going to take Agag. Maybe I'm going to march him around the cities of Israel going, look, here's Agag. I took him out and ultimately would have put him to death at some point. That's not what God wanted. God wanted him. He wanted him dead, and he wanted him dead now, immediately. It wasn't, a matter of, well, when you get to it. It was do it now. And for whatever reason, Saul decided that, no, if I do it eventually, that's good enough. We see here, Samuel here takes this moral high ground. This is one of the most dynamic and compelling statements in the Old Testament about obedience to God. This is an incredibly high point in prophetic utterance on the part of Samuel and the part of any of the prophets. This is really high ground, and it becomes such powerful high ground that it is used in other scriptures. We find the concept at least carried forward from several of the other prophets who use similar language, probably taken from this passage, or at least referenced in this passage. If we look back at Hosea, for example, in Hosea 6 and verse 6, Hosea writes there and says, I'll back up to verse 4. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? And what shall I do with you, O Judah? For your loyalty is like a morning cloud and like dew that goes away early. Therefore I have hewn them in pieces by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and the judgments are on you like light that goes forth. For I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than in burnt offerings. And so here again, here we see in a number of cases, we're going to see where these prophets, various prophets, will use language similar to what Samuel uses here, because this is again that moral high ground about obedience to God. Isaiah 1 and verse 11. Isaiah says there, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What are your multiplied sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle, and I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who inquires of you of this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the callings of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the solemn assembly. We find, again, this, and I've got other listings up here from Jeremiah, from Micah, and Jesus validates this in Matthew 9 and verse 13, as he references it as well. Matthew 9 and verse 13, he quotes Hosea that we read, but it's the same idea. It's that same idea of obedience is better than sacrifice. In 9 and verse 13, he says, go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And there we see again, here's even Jesus validating this. Again, one of the most powerful statements about obedience we'll find anywhere, even in the Bible, but especially in the Old Testament, is as Samuel is basically dressing down Saul rather, for his failure to obey. Notice how he takes the things that Saul has done and he equates them in their mind, in the Israelite mind. They're, like us, they have a tendency to want to kind of classify sins. Some sins are very bad sins, and some sins are maybe not so bad sins. And yet, Samuel classifies these as among the worst of sins. Because as he points out here, he says, for rebellion is as the sin of divination. Well, divination was a bad sin. That was trying to use occult powers to find out what was going on instead of asking of God. And he says, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Again, equating those things with idolatry, which to the Israelites, that was, again, one of the, they were repeatedly told in the law of Moses, you will not have idols, you will not make graven images, you will not worship that way. And they understood that to be a sin. They didn't always care that it was a sin, but they understood that it was a sin. And yet here is Samuel, pointing out to Saul. And remember now, Saul, of course, in the course of his reign, he was at least a follower of form. We found that a number of times where he was at least a follower of form in worship to God. He would try to modify things as it suited him to fit his own agenda, but would follow after form. And for Samuel then to say, what you've done is as bad as if you had been sacrificing to idols. What you've done is as bad as if you'd been practicing divination. Why, that would have been a shocking statement to Saul. That would have been, we can understand then why there comes apparently this enmity between now Samuel and Saul, because this would have been a shocking thing to have said to Saul, given his mindset at this point. And we see Saul's response, verse 24. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I have indeed transgressed the command of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and listened to their voice. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty contrite statement. That sounds pretty good as a contrite statement. But if we look at it fairly carefully, we realize it's not quite what it appears. Because first of all, when he says, I have sinned, well, the word that he uses for sin there is not a typical word for sin, but means more of an overlooking. I missed something. Did I miss something? It's almost as if it was an accident, see? I didn't do this on purpose, Samuel. It was, I just kind of, I forgot. Or I missed something, okay? As if it were some minor point that I failed to understand. It has that connotation in the language. And he says, and because I feared the people. Saul, you're in charge of the people. You're the leader of the people. What do you mean you're afraid of them? What does it mean? What do you mean you're afraid of the people? What do you think they're going to do? You think they're going to rebel against you being king? Do you really think they're going to do that? He said, and he said, so I listened to their voice. And Samuel, of course, is, I think, fairly disgusted about that. In spite of his position of leadership, here's Saul still trying to continue to blame the people. Samuel said to Saul, I will, now therefore, verse 25, now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. Won't you forgive me? He doesn't understand he sinned against God, but he's asking Samuel rather, for pardon. Well, I'm sorry, Samuel. I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, Samuel. Well, no, that's not the point. You didn't hurt, Samuel's not saying you hurt my feelings. Samuel's saying you failed to obey God. And yet Saul is trying to, notice again, he's trying to spin it. Well, it's not God really mad at me, it's you mad at me, Samuel. There's a little bit of spin here. Please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. So Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. And also the glory of Israel shall not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. Then he said, I have sinned, but please honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel, and go back with me that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back following Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Saul's here effort to try and keep Samuel from going, this was not as simply, I'm just going to grab your clothing. Apparently this was a manhandling. Some of the commentators, the Bible scholars think there may have been something frantic or fearful on the part of Saul. Others think that there may have been some real aggression here on the part of Saul towards Samuel. Virtually an attack to prevent him from going. Just grabbing hold of him and physically restraining him from trying to go, as Samuel's trying to turn away, to the point that the clothing rips. And of course, in tearing his robe, it presents then for Samuel a prophetic symbol. Just as you have torn my robe, God's going to tear the kingdom from you, and give him, and make sure that he understands that message. We then, though, see that Samuel then ultimately relents and decides to go with Saul. Why? Why does Samuel, who says, I'm not going to go, first of all, he says, I will not return with you in verse 26, but then in verse 31, he went back from following Samuel, or from following Saul. And so he does go along with him. So the question is, why does Saul change his mind, or Samuel rather? Why does Samuel change his mind? And some of the commentators, the Bible scholars looking at this think, well, Saul does make this appeal to him, saying, please honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel. Basically there is the kingdom to consider, Samuel. I know you're mad at me, but consider the kingdom and consider basically the unity, the continuation of the nation. And that appeal may have worked for Samuel to persuade him to stay. All right, I'm going to stop there. We'll talk about the end of chapter 15 again some more next week, and we'll go on into chapter 16 and beyond next week. Appreciate your attention this morning. Thank you.